In 1989, for example, Cheney wrote an essay for a talk he was going to give at a conservative think tank about what he termed congressional overreach in foreign policy. He never delivered this talk because he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense, and he wanted to avoid controversy before he was confirmed. But during the research, I obtained a copy. And in this essay, Cheney explains that he wants to get beyond the legal arguments over the possible meanings of what he somewhat disparagingly calls the parchment document, and explain why, for pragmatic reasons, he endorsed an interpretation that gave stronger powers to the President and a lesser role for Congress. Cheney takes the opposite view of the founders, who thought that it was too risky to let one person control the major national security decisions of the country. Cheney said it was too risky to have more than one person control such decisions, because any rule in which Congress is to influence these decisions would increase the likelihood of leaks and diminish the likelihood of a proposed covert intelligence strike or military attack going forward. And thus, Cheney wrote back in 1989, quote, "The real world effect turns out not to be a transfer of power from the President to Congress, but rather a denial of power to the government as a whole." Close quote. In other words, the nation is more likely to take aggressive action in national security matters if the Commander-in-Chief gets to make such calls completely at his own discretion, if there are no rules to which he is subject, and if he has exclusive control over the zone of the nation's diplomacy, intelligence activities, and military operations. There were others who agreed with Cheney that presidential power should be put back to the level it briefly achieved before Nixon fell. A faction arose within the ranks of the Republican Party that abandoned the traditional conservative suspicion of concentrated government power. This faction, which arose after Watergate, is sometimes called the Presidentialists. But their goal faced an obstacle, because even if you buy into the idea that the Constitution gives presidents vast inherent or unwritten power, an inherent executive power is not the same thing as an exclusive executive power. That is to say, it's one thing to say that if necessity arises, the President can direct the government to do something that he was not specifically authorized to do, like a Constitution or a federal law. For example, monitoring phone calls in search of spies and terrorists. But it's a very different thing to say that Congress cannot later choose to step in if it wants to, and pass a law regulating how the President must go about doing that thing from now on, as Congress did in 1978, when, following 2 decades of revelations of presidents in both parties using their surveillance powers to spy on domestic political enemies, Congress passed a law requiring the government to start obtaining warrants for a judge for such eavesdropping. But during the 1980s, presidentialists on the Reagan administration legal team came up with something called the unitary executive theory. This rested on a revisionist interpretation of the Constitution, whereby Congress cannot pass laws that fracture the president's control of the executive branch, or anything deemed to be a power that is executive in nature. Now, back in the 1980s, advocates of the unitary executive theory had been thinking about domestic issues, such as control of the independent agencies. Maybe the president ought to be able to raise more interest rates at will, rather than waiting for the Federal Reserve to decide what to do independently. But after 9/11, the Bush-Cheney legal team revived the unitary executive theory and dramatically expanded its sweep to encompass matters of national security. In their hands, the theory transformed any conceivably inherent commander-in-chief power into an exclusive one that Congress cannot regulate. And if this vision were accepted as true, then the unchecked powers sought by Cheney and his allies in all those years of debate in Congress for the president already existed, regardless of what Congress chose to say in statutes and treaties. These powers were just slumbering in wait of a president willing to start using them. In 2001, the Bush-Cheney administration started using these powers. On September 25, 2001, 2 weeks after 9/11, a deputy in the Justice Department named John Yoo completed a secret memo that would lay out the powers the executive branch believed itself free to exercise in the coming war on terrorism. The secret memo asserted as fact that, quote, the president's powers include inherent executive powers that are unenumerated in the Constitution, close quote. Among them, the right to use military force as he alone saw fit, regardless of the Quote, "We think it beyond question," we wrote, "that Congress cannot place any limits on the President's determination as to any terrorist threat, the amount of military force to use as response, or the method, timing, and nature of that response, because these decisions under our Constitution are for the President alone to make," close quote. And I think you can see that this is a vision of a commander-in-chief who is above the rule of law. Although this view runs counter to mainstream and traditional understandings of the Constitution and what the founders were trying to do 200 years ago, it would not be long before the administration discovered opportunities to turn its aggressive theory into real-world action. Each time a problem arose, and many problems would arise in the weeks and months after 9/11, including the matters of detention, interrogation, surveillance, the inner circle of key decision makers at the White House looked at their options and then picked a solution to those options that relied upon the greatest possible assertion of unilateral presidential power to bypass statutory and treaty restraints. By acting on these theories, they transformed them into facts, into precedents that future presidents, too, will be able to cite when they want to eliminate